On this last section in Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology in the Endocrine System, we're going to be talking about the pancreas and the hormones that are produced by the pancreas. The pancreas is an interesting organ because it is both an endocrine organ and an exocrine organ, and you see this with a few organs in the body. Remember, the difference between an exocrine and an endocrine organ is where they release the molecules and the hormones that they're producing, their excretions basically. So an exocrine gland is one that produces excretions that move into ducts and are released into the exterior, and that means either onto the skin, such as sweat glands and sebaceous glands, but also the outside of the inside of our body, and that's where the pancreas comes in. So the pancreas produces a number of enzymes that are used in digestion, and we'll talk more about those when we look at the chapter on, or talk the lecture on the digestive system. And then the pancreas also has endocrine function, and the endocrine glands are the ones that do not release their excretions into ducts, but they release them into the blood inside the body. And so the pancreas has both functions. Today we're just going to be looking at the endocrine functions of the pancreas. And the hormones in the pancreas are ones that you're probably familiar with, and I'm sure you've heard of at least once or twice. The most well-known one is insulin, and insulin is known for its job in helping the cells take in glucose. So every cell in our body needs glucose in order to burn, to produce ATP, or to produce energy. If our cells don't have glucose, they won't be able to produce that energy. They won't be able to do what they're able to do. But in one of the very first lectures we talked about membrane transport, and we mentioned the types of molecules that can move through the cell membrane or the plasma membrane of the cells and into the cells. So things like oxygen and CO2 can diffuse in and out of cells through that membrane. And those are important because oxygen is also used along with glucose to produce energy. CO2 is a waste product that we have to remove, and so those are able to move through the plasma membrane all by themselves. Glucose, on the other hand, cannot. So this is our plasma membrane. Glucose cannot get through the plasma membrane by itself. It's too large. Oxygen, as we just talked about, it can diffuse right through the plasma membrane. Glucose cannot, but the cells need glucose. So some way that glucose has to get in. And so there are channel proteins that provide an opening that allow glucose to go in. But insulin is required in order for those membranes to allow glucose to come into the cell. So without insulin, none of the cells in your body can get glucose. It doesn't matter how much glucose you have running around in your blood, and you see this with problems such as diabetes. These people have a lot of glucose running around in their blood, but it's not able to get into the cells, and so it doesn't do you any good. And in fact, it causes problems because of the high levels of glucose in the blood. So basically, you have all this energy running around the body, but the cells aren't able to grab that and use it for what its purpose is. The other hormone is glucagon, and it also deals with the glucose levels in our blood. But in the case of glucagon, this is when glucose levels are low in the blood. It triggers the body to break down glycogen. Sorry, that word almost disappeared from my mind there for a second. Anyway, glycogen break down glycogen and releases glucose back into the blood. So we want to maintain a certain level of glucose in our blood at all times. If it goes too high, that's a problem, and then our body will release insulin and pull it into cells. If it goes too low, then that's also a problem. So the pancreas will release this glucagon, which will cause the glucose to rise again. And there's other hormones in the pancreas that are produced as well, but these are two that we are going to focus on. Inside the pancreas, you have these little places within the pancreas. So inside the pancreas, in this exocrine and endocrine gland, the tissue, the endocrine and exocrine tissue, are all packed together. There isn't a certain, you can't take a pancreas and say, well, this half of it is exocrine, this half is endocrine. No, it's all mixed therein together. And so within the pancreas, we have these little areas that they call pancreatic islets. And these little pancreatic islets are the areas where these are the endocrine part of the pancreas. And so within these islets, we have different types of cells, and depending on the cell is going to determine what type of hormone that it's producing. So there's two main types that we're going to look at. We have alpha cells, shown here, and the alpha cells, their job is to produce the glucagon, and then we also have the beta cells here, and their job is to produce the insulin. So these two, depending on the cell, producing these hormones released into the blood, and then they're able to do their job that way. This process also works through negative feedback, so a similar method that we've already seen. So we have a certain level of glucose we want in the blood. If that level gets too high, then that's going to trigger the pancreas to release insulin from the beta cells, and that's going to trigger the cells within the body to pull that glucose out of the blood into the cell. That's going to lower the glucose level in the blood, and it's going to turn, and then that's going to lower the amount of glucose. We'll get back to homeostasis. Also, the pancreas is shown here can also trigger if your cells don't need more glucose, if they've got all the energy they need, then it also triggers the liver to take up that extra glucose, and it stores it as glycogen. On the other hand, if our blood glucose levels start to drop, then our body this will trigger the pancreas to release that glucagon from the alpha cells. The glucagon signals the liver to break down the glycogen that's stored there. And remember, the glycogen is just a molecule made up of glucose molecules all hooked together. So it just starts chopping up the glycogen, then that releases glucose. It can put it back in the blood, brings those levels back to normal. So this is a negative feedback system, similar to, as always, the negative feedback is similar to a thermostat in our body. And so as these levels get back to normal, it's going to shut off this pathway that's being used. This is probably a good time to stop real quick and talk a little bit about diabetes. Diabetes, I'm sure you've heard about. There's two main types of diabetes. We have type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. And when we say diabetes, we're usually talking about the whole word is actually diabetes mellitus, because there is another type of diabetes called diabetes insipidus, which we'll talk about later, which doesn't deal with the glucose at all. But usually when someone says diabetes, this is what they're talking about, is problems with insulin and glucose. Someone that has diabetes, how they used to find out or realize that somebody has diabetes is they would actually taste the urine, because what's happening is, because there's so much glucose flowing around in the blood, that glucose starts to spill over into the urine as the body's cleaning the blood and taking out the things in blood it doesn't need. Glucose ends up in the urine. Glucose isn't supposed to be in the urine. If you ever have glucose in the urine, that's always pointing to some sort of problem, and it could be diabetes. And so that's how they used to be able to diagnose that. And someone that has diabetes may notice the sweet-smelling urine, and that may be something that will trigger their mind and let them know that they may be suffering from diabetes. Another thing that happens is you get what's called ketosis. And what's happening here is the cells in your body, they use glucose to produce energy. But if they can't get glucose, they still have to produce energy. If they don't produce energy, they start to die. Glucose is the energy molecule of choice. That's what your cells want to burn. But again, if there's no glucose present, then the cells are going to turn and start breaking down other things. And what they start breaking down is proteins, which of course can be very bad, because proteins are the building blocks. That's what your cells need to function. And so if you're breaking down proteins for energy, you're not going to be able to use those proteins for other things they need to be used for. The other thing is, it starts to break down fats, and if you break down a lot of fats, you end up with acidic byproducts, and those acidic byproducts start to build up inside the blood. And so you start to get acidosis in the blood, or a very acidic blood, which can be a problem due to these metabolic leftovers called ketones. So we call this ketosis. And so those are some of the signs of diabetes. Now there's two main types of diabetes. There's type 1 diabetes, and this is often called juvenile diabetes because it shows up usually in younger children. That's not a hard, fast rule. Type 2 diabetes is called adult onset, but again, it doesn't just have to happen in adults versus children. But in general, that's where they're going to be diagnosed. And so type 1 diabetes is maybe the more severe of the types of diabetes, because in this case, the person's body, for some reason, is destroying the cells in the pancreas. So it's an autoimmune disease, destroying the beta cells, so the body is no longer able to produce insulin. And so this leads to problems with not being able to pull the glucose from the blood. Someone that has type 1 diabetes, they are going to have insulin injections. And so today, they have these little pumps that they carry around with them that will constantly monitor and be able to release the insulin depending on the amount of glucose inside the blood. And so, but someone that has type 1 diabetes, they'll usually be very skinny, and this can be the more difficult of the two types to deal with. And someone with this type of diabetes has probably been dealing with it throughout their life. Type 2 diabetes we call adult onset because this often shows up in adults and is linked with obesities, some people often call this the rich man's disease because it's linked to this obesity to well-fed people, so first world countries. So you don't really see type 2 diabetes in countries where people aren't getting enough to eat, but in developed countries you see this more often. So this is a real problem in the United States as this increases. And in this case, you still have those pancreatic cells, you have the beta cells, and your body is producing insulin, but for some reason the cells aren't recognizing that. So we call this insulin resistant type 2 diabetes. This can be controlled through diet and exercise, and there may be also insulin injections that are needed. But it does still cause some problems, and if the glucose levels rise too much, then it can lead to some of the same problems that diabetes, type 1 diabetes, blindness, may even have to have amputations of limbs. If the blood glucose levels get too high, it can go into a coma and things like that. So these can be very dangerous. They are very dangerous diseases that have to be controlled. But that's what they're related to. They're related to this pancreatic gland and its ability to release that insulin. So those are the two main hormones of the pancreas that I wanted to talk about. To end up this lecture, though, I just want to mention a couple other hormones that are found in other smaller or less well-known, not necessarily less well-known, but other glands that aren't some of these major ones we've talked about. I also want to point out that there's a nice table in your book, table 9.1, that has a list of all the glands and the hormones that are listed there and everything they do. That's a nice little list that you can look at to refer to figure out a little bit more about these different hormones. There's the pineal gland. This is found in the brain, and it secretes melatonin. And this is very important with our sleep cycles and our wake cycles. It keeps our body, if your body's not getting enough melatonin, or I guess I should say, if your melatonin release is messed up, then your sleep cycle and your wake cycles aren't going to be working as they should. And so, especially people that have to sleep during the day, say they're working at night, if their sleep and wake cycle are messed up, and if they're sleeping during the day and it's not dark enough, then that's going to affect their melatonin release, and it can make them feel drowsy and things throughout the day. So there's not a lot really that's known about the melatonin and the pineal gland and all of its functions, but that is definitely one of the things that it does. We also have the thymus gland. It's posterior to the sternum. It's the largest in infants and children, and then it starts to decrease over time. We'll talk about this later when we talk about the immune system, but there are types of white blood cells that develop in the thymus gland. We call those T cells to stand for the thymus gland, and they're dealing with the immune system and fighting off infections and things like that. You also have the gonads, so the ovaries in females, testes in males. One of the main functions, of course, is in females to produce eggs. Testes in males produce sperm. There's also hormones that are produced as well. In females, we have estrogens and progesterones that are produced by the ovaries. In males, in the testes, we have the androgens, such as testosterone, that are produced there. The testosterone, the androgens are important in producing secondary male sex characteristics, producing sperm. The ovaries, the estrogens and progesterones are important in the release of the egg and the menstrual cycle, lactation, breast development, and things like this, the secondary female characteristics as well. And we'll see more of these when we talk about the reproductive system a little bit later in this class. Finally, there is the placenta as well. There's other places within the body, other organs that do release other endocrine hormones. I want to mention the placenta real quick, and this is during pregnancy. The placenta produces a certain hormone that is very important called HCG. Besides estrogen and progesterone, and this is important in early pregnancy. This keeps the pregnancy going. This signals the body that the female body that the female is pregnant, and basically tells her body not to have the menstrual cycle, not to get rid of that uterine lining because there's a baby growing there now. And this HCG, this is what pregnancy tests for, to see if there's any of this flowing around in the blood. Later in the pregnancy, the placenta will start producing estrogen and progesterone and take over that job for the ovaries as well, and then also produces other hormones that are important when the delivery comes about. So these are some of the hormones that are found in the endocrine gland and their job. And again, the endocrine system is very important in controlling and helping us maintain homeostasis and carry out the functions of our body.